Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan. We are back with the Federalist lecture number 2 today, the Anti-Federalists.
In this lecture, Dr. Pestritto talks about the adversaries of the ratification of the Constitution who were given the name Anti-Federalists by the Federalists, a clever piece of political maneuvering. And the point that Dr. Pestritto makes in this lecture is that the so-called Anti-Federalists were American patriots. They believed in the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Many of them supported the majority of the Constitution, but disputed a few provisions. And so as we examine their arguments, we should be thinking about them as true American founders who had some arguments against the way the Constitution was structured. We shouldn't think of them as the bad guys or losers or anything like that. They helped strengthen the way the final Constitution looked, including providing the Bill of Rights.
American history, we've always had strong political differences in the country, and I think to a certain degree that's healthy as long as both sides have the same ends in mind, right? The Federalists, it's great they get into a definition of a people, what makes a people, and one of them is they have essentially the same definition of justice, and that means that they believe that the purpose of government is the same, and in their case, to secure the rights of citizens and lead them to a happy life.
Right.
And both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists believe that strongly. They just differed on what's the right way to achieve that end.
There were questions about means rather than ends. The founders, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, would wholeheartedly agree that the purpose of man is to find happiness, and they understood that to mean piety, devotion to God, moral excellence, and the normal joy of being satisfied in your everyday life. They were all committed to that, but they were trying to find the best way to achieve it. If you're following along with us on our website, you know that we have excerpts from the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. If you'd like to dive in and read those works in whole, go to hillsdale.edu/course to pick up a copy of the Federalist and a collection of Anti-Federalist papers. That's hillsdale.edu/course to get the books that Dr. Pestritto uses. Now let's turn to Dr. Pestritto with Lecture 2 of the Federalist, the Anti-Federalists.
Welcome back to our course on the Federalist. In our last session, we introduced the broad themes of the book. And here in this session, before we start jumping into the actual text, we're going to take some time to consider the arguments of the opponents of the Federalists, the so-called Anti-Federalists. And one of the reasons it's important to do this is that so much of the argumentation we see in the Federalist is made in response to certain key objections of the Anti-Federalist adversaries. And so if you think about that, it actually makes the rhetorical accomplishment of the Federalist even more impressive. Because on the one hand, they're giving this very orderly explanation of the Constitution, and they're laying it all out there in a coherent way. But they're doing that all while incorporating and making sure they respond to multiple times some of the most important objections raised by the Anti-Federalists. Now, let's say a word in favor of the Anti-Federalists, which may seem strange in a course on the Federalist Papers. But the Anti-Federalists, I think, are often not given enough regard in history. And I suppose the main reason for that is that they lost. They're the losers in this debate. We know that the Constitution was ratified, after all, and so apparently they did not succeed. Now, a couple things about that. First of all, we have to understand that the Anti-Federalists are a very diverse group. There are a lot of different individuals who come under this label, and the label means those who were opposed in one way or another to the ratification of the Constitution, or at least to certain provisions of it. And so we should bear in mind, not every Anti-Federalist opposed ratification. Some were in favor of ratification if certain revisions could be made. Some of the most persuasive Anti-Federalists are those who admitted, yes, we are having problems, and the Articles of Confederation do need to be amended. just not in the way that the Federalists are proposing, or at least not in the way that they're proposing in every respect. So thinking of the Anti-Federalists that write under the name the Federal Farmer, for example, or Brutus. These are men who agreed something had to be done, but had very strong objections to certain features of the new Constitution. As for this idea that the Anti-Federalists were the losers, I suppose that's true in one respect. Americans like winners, of course, but the Anti-Federalists actually won in one very important way. It was due to their arguments that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, were incorporated. And the proponents of the Constitution had basically to promise that they would get that done as soon as the new government was seated. That's not a minor victory. If you went around and asked the man on the street today if he could recognize this or that part of the Constitution, surely it's the case that the most commonly known parts of the Constitution actually come from the Bill of Rights. They don't come from the part that was written at the convention. They come from the First Amendment, free speech, or the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. Those are the Anti-Federalist parts. Those were actually added after the convention, after the government was seated. And so the Anti-Federalists very much won. They were founders. They were among that group of individuals whom we refer to as our founders. Some had signed the Declaration of Independence. Most considered themselves to be defenders of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. If you put yourself in their position, you fight a revolution, you declare your independence, and you fight this revolution on the basis of certain core principles, equal natural rights for all men, and you form a government on the basis of these principles after fighting a tough war. And then along come these Federalists, and they want to change things up very, very quickly after that's done. They want to move away from that form of government that was established coming out of the Revolution. The Anti-Federalists see themselves as defenders of the Revolution. And everybody here agrees, Federalist and Anti-Federalist alike, in the goal of being a republic. That that's the most just form of government. That's the form of government that's most fitting for human beings given their nature. The question is, what particular forms, what particular arrangement of institutions is best going to achieve that? And that's where the difference is. But they are certainly fellow founders. This point about the Anti-Federalists is important to keep in mind because they agreed with the Federalists. They subscribed as much as the Federalists did to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. They believed in natural rights. They were not admirers of some kind of pre-liberal or pre-Enlightenment order that sometimes is championed in certain circles of the intellectual right today. They were right there with the Federalists in their belief in the natural rights principles of the Declaration. One other thing to keep in mind before we go too far down the road of painting the Anti-Federalists as the losers in this debate, they are at a tremendous disadvantage. We're talking in this course about a book called The Federalist or the Federalist Papers. And anytime one wants to look for arguments in defense of the Constitution, this is the source you go to. It's a remarkable achievement. We should keep in mind that it's not like there weren't other writings at the time that spoke in favor of the Constitution. There were lots of them in the public press. But does anybody know what they are? We refer to the Federalist. That speaks for the pro-Constitution side. This single thing, and it's very organized, and it's coordinated, and it's planned. And the book, The Federalist, as we mentioned last session, was planned by these authors. It was published by them right during the middle of this debate. If, on the other hand, you go to the bookstore today and you want to find a parallel version on the Anti-Federalist side, if you want to go get a copy of the Anti-Federalist or the Anti-Federalist Papers, well, there are lots of those available, many different editions. But none of them was written or planned by the Anti-Federalists. They were all edited by contemporary scholars, contemporary historians, from the many, many diverse arguments against ratification that were made during the founding period. And so one Anti-Federalist book isn't like necessarily another Anti-Federalist book. And so the arguments are very much spread all over. And that's a difficult hill to climb. It's one of the reasons why, if you spend some time reading the essays of the Anti-Federalists, they sometimes seem to read like everything but the kitchen sink is in every essay. And if you put yourself in their position, you're getting a chance to make your case in a newspaper article. You're not part of a book plan. You're not part of this pre-planned order of an unfolding, organized argument. And so you're going to throw everything you got all at once. You're going to make your very best arguments. And it's why the Anti-Federalists can sometimes appear repetitive, or there's too much going on in a single paper. That's because they don't have the form, they don't have the advantage of writing that single book together in a way that the Federalists do. Like Publius, most of the Anti-Federalists use pen names. And they use them for the sake of anonymity, for the reasons that we discussed last time. And also they use them for the sake of making a point about the arguments that they're forwarding. And some of the most well-known Anti-Federalist writers, think of the writer Brutus, for example. That's a pretty obvious reference to what that writer thinks he's doing. He's trying to save the Republic from tyranny. Or Cato, clearly a reference to Cato the Younger and his very similar position in Roman history and the status of the Roman Republic. So the use of these pen names is there on both sides, although many of the Anti-Federalist writings we have are also in the name of the writer or the statesman himself. For example, some of the most well-known Anti-Federalist writings are from Patrick Henry, and we get those from the notes of his speeches made on the floor of the Virginia Ratifying Convention. Others are done in their name as well, and so it's just an indication of how much variety there is among the Anti-Federalists. I'm going to organize the main themes of Anti-Federalist argument into three basic categories. And these categories aren't really original to me. Most famously, they're used by a man named Herbert Storing, who is one of the most well-known editors of Anti-Federalist writings. But I think they're very useful for working our way through what is a very diverse set of writings. And so just at the outset, the three categories are the conservatism of the Anti-Federalist, the argument by the Anti-Federalists in favor of small republics, and finally the argument that the national government was far too strong under the newly proposed Constitution. So conservatism, republicanism, and one might say anti-consolidationism. Those are the three main categories. Let's talk first about the conservatism of the Anti-Federalists. These guys were the conservatives in this debate. And I mean that in the kind of dictionary definition sense of what it means to be a conservative. A conservative is somebody who is very cautious about proposed change, is generally going to favor keeping things the way they are, and is going to look with scrutiny at those wanting to change up, and especially to change up so quickly. Remember, the new Constitution is proposed just a few years after we had won the Revolutionary War and adopted the Articles of Confederation. And so it's a very straightforward conservative position to just say, hey, let's tap the brakes here a little bit. Why all these radical changes? Things are going just fine. Yes, there's some upheaval, but let's stay the course. Right? That's the conservative position in this debate. The Anti-Federalists were conservative in a few different ways that I want to lead you through. First of all, like any good conservative, they raised the legal questions. They raised the questions of form. Are the changes that are being proposed, are they consistent with our existing procedures? Are they legal? Do they follow the law? And the Anti-Federalists here pointed out a couple of very obvious facts. First of all, the calling of the convention was very irregular. Why wasn't this being done in the ordinary Congress under the Articles of Confederation, the existing form of government? Why was there this kind of separate ad hoc meeting? Certainly a very dubious legal standing. And then the product of the convention. Here's a proposal for a change in government, not just a change in government, a wholesale change. Now, the Articles of Confederation, the existing system of government that's in place, has a prescribed method for the way that changes to the system of government are supposed to be made. Those changes require the consent of all 13 states. But as we know, that wasn't what the convention required. They said, well, once 9 states agree, then we're going to go with this. Well, on what legal basis? On no legal basis. And so it would be as if today a group had a constitutional convention and just came out and said, well, we're going to have these changes that we've proposed be adopted by the country, and just to make up their own method that didn't have anything to do with the existing method of constitutional amendment. And so the Anti-Federalists said, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right, this doesn't seem proper. The second kind of conservative argument that the Anti-Federalists make is again, a very standard argument for conservatives. It's one in defense of stability, that there's just an inherent advantage to keeping things as they are, that you create problems when you change things up, when there's unpredictability. And in any political community, these are important values. Furthermore, the Anti-Federalists say, you Federalists are not only proposing ordinary change in law, you're proposing changes in the fundamental law, our fundamental system of government. This isn't simply a policy dispute. Hey, we don't like this or that tax policy or this or that foreign policy, and we're going to change it up. No, it's a change in the fundamental system of government. And this is something that when you do it, it's very upsetting to the political community. It's very destabilizing. Imagine if we had a constitutional convention today in our country. If you think things are really divided and really intense in our politics, imagine if that were the situation. So here the Federalists are doing that, and they're doing that just a couple of years after we've had a Revolutionary War, after we've had a couple of continental congresses that came up with our existing form of government. And James Madison himself, in the 49th Federalist paper, makes a case, a very strong case, against frequent constitutional changes. You can't go doing this all the time. You have to make it really hard to change the Constitution. Madison in 49 is defending the mechanism in the Constitution, how difficult it is to amend. And Madison says, yeah, this is bad for stability if you allow frequent constitutional change. And so the Anti-Federalists are saying, yeah, what you said in 49, don't go changing the fundamental law so frequently. Another way in which we see the Anti-Federalists as the conservatives are them being very skeptical about how necessary this change is. It's an argument about what are the facts on the ground? Yeah, things are bad. The economy is really quite bad at this time. I'll say more about that a little bit later. Are they so bad to justify this kind of change? There's an argument about what the circumstances are. If you look at the early papers in the Federalist, numbers, say, 3 through 10 or 3 through 12, Publius is making a case for the extreme necessity. He's making a case, hey, there's a real crisis. Our very lives and property and good order are at stake if we don't do something. If we continue down this road we're on, we're going to be in very grave danger. And the Anti-Federalists, like any good conservative in such a debate, is saying, well, wait a minute, we think you might be exaggerating here a little bit. Are things really that bad? And if things really aren't that bad, if the Federalists are exaggerating, why would they exaggerate? What would their motive be? And this is where the Anti-Federalists kind of take the gloves off, at least some of them do. And I want to read you a passage from an Anti-Federalist whom I mentioned a moment ago called the Federal Farmer, and to look at what he says, what he thinks the motives might be for the Federalists kind of exaggerating the nature of the crisis. This is from the first letter of the Federal Farmer. It is natural for men who wish to hasten the adoption of a measure to tell us, now is the crisis. Now is the critical moment, which must be seized or all will be lost. and to shut the door against free inquiry, whenever conscious that the thing presented has defects in it, which time and investigation will probably discover. This has been the custom of tyrants and their dependents in all ages. So he's really taking the gloves off there. Those are nasty words. This isn't just a difference about what the situation on the ground is. You're making this up to make the people feel constrained, to tell them, yes, go ahead and consider the arguments, but consider pretty quickly or there's going to be incredible trouble that will come. As to the second category of anti-federalist argument, their defense of a small republic and their criticism of the size or the extent of the territory over which the Federalists proposed to have this new republic. This, to me, gets right to the heart of the matter. For the Anti-Federalists, their version of republicanism is all about getting as much participation, as much consent from the people as you possibly can. Their ideal is the classical republic, the very directly democratic forms of cities like Athens, where if you can arrange it, the people themselves should be making decisions immediately. And you have forms of majority rule that basically determine the most important policies. And the Anti-Federalists certainly realize that exact model isn't feasible given even the size of the smallest state. But they think that it should be aimed for as much as possible. So any form of government which tries to detract from that, which tries to lessen participation, they're going to be very critical of.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
If we think about this understanding of republicanism, you can see why the Anti-Federalists would very much be in favor of a small republic. They argue Republican government, as we Anti-Federalists understand it, you could really only have it in a small territory. How can you get most people consenting, most people participating, if there are too many of them? You can't get them all in the same place. They don't really know one another. You can't really have any serious kind of deliberation. There's no internet, there's no television. And so republicanism, the real direct consent, the real majority rule kind of republicanism, can only succeed in a small territory. When you have republicanism in a small territory, you get a key feature of republicanism for the Anti-Federalists, and that is the voluntary attachment of the citizens to the laws. And this is a fundamental point of the Anti-Federalists. In other kinds of regimes, in a monarchy or some other form of regime, whether or not the citizens like the law, it's not essential, right? If you're the monarch and you make the rules and some of your subjects don't want to obey, that's what you've got an army for. And you can go in and coerce them. The Anti-Federalists point out that's not how a republic works. In a republic, the people are part of making the law. The law reflects how they want to live. And so they shouldn't need to be forced to obey the law. Their attachment to the law should be voluntary. Now, they're not naive. They're not saying there's never going to be a criminal or deviants or people who try to game the system. That's not what they're saying. But they're saying that most people are going to see the law as truly representative of them and the way they want to live, and they're going to want to obey it. And if they don't want to obey it, they'll make different laws that they do want to obey. And so that idea of voluntary attachment is key. The fear of the Anti-Federalist is, in a large republic, that not every citizen will feel that way. They'll see the law as being made by somebody distant from them, somebody whom they don't know, and being imposed on them. And it will be more like an empire, more like, one of the Roman far-flung provinces where the people wish they weren't under the Roman thumb, and then every once in a while Rome has to send the army in to force obedience. The Anti-Federalists think we're going to get into that kind of situation. And let me read you one of the arguments. This passage is also from the Federal Farmer, and he says the following: "The laws of a free government rest on the confidence of the people and operate gently, and never can extend their influence very far if they are executed on free principles about the center, where the benefits of the government induce the people to support it voluntarily. Yet they must be executed on the principles of fear and force in the extremes. This has been the case with every extensive republic of which we have any accurate account." You see there the influence again of Roman history. When Rome started to expand, when it got too large, it had to rely on force and fear and ceased being a republic. Another advantage of keeping a republic small in size is that you were much more likely to have a homogeneous citizenry. What I mean by that is the citizens are much more like one another. They're much more likely to be the same, to have the same customs, to have the same way of life, to have the same religion. The citizens that you're dealing with who are making the laws, after all, who are consenting to the laws, are consenting to laws that reflect a way of life that they all share. I can't overemphasize this principle. This is what it means, bottom line, to be a republic for the Anti-Federalists. What a republic is a group of people, a relatively small group of people, who share a common way of life and who get to make laws that reflect that shared way of life. Period. That's republicanism. And so when you bring in other kinds of people, when you extend the territory too much, you bring in a diversity of views, a diversity of interests, that's a problem for republicanism. Now bear that in mind, because you're going to see James Madison in the 10th Federalist paper make exactly the opposite argument about an extended territory. Yet another advantage of a small republic for the Anti-Federalists is that they believe that the small republic is the place where representation works as it should. This is a very key principle for them. The Anti-Federalists see representation as a necessary evil. And what I mean by that is, the ideal would be, if you have a true republic, the purest form of republic, it would be all of the citizens meeting directly and deciding matters themselves. You would have no representative institution. Today, in our republic, we have representative institutions. At the federal level, at least, we don't make laws ourselves. We elect people to represent us, and they go off into an institution, and hopefully they do what we elected them to do. That's a representative form. For the Anti-Federalists, that's not the pure Republican form. Every citizen should have a direct role. We see this in some very small towns where you do have some kind of direct governance in that way, but it's fairly rare. Now, the Anti-Federalists, again, they realize even the smallest state is far too large to have that form of pure government in any serious or sustained way. And so you have to have representative institutions. They're not denying that. All of these states have legislatures. But because the point of the representative institution is basically to substitute for a direct meeting of the people themselves, for the Anti-Federalists, a representative institution should do, if it's operating properly, it should yield what the people themselves would have done if it were logistically possible for all of them to get together in the same place. It should be a carbon copy of the people themselves. And as a result, you really can only have a representative institution in a small republic, because otherwise, when the republic gets too large, when the population gets too numerous, it's very, very difficult for a small institution to mimic or to replicate what such a large group of people would do. Let me read you an Anti-Federalist explanation of this. And this is from the Federal Farmer. This is in his second letter. He says, "The essential parts of a free and good government are a full and equal representation of the people in the legislature, and the jury trial of the vicinages in the administration of justice. And a full and equal representation is that which possesses the same interests, feelings, opinions, and views the people themselves would, were they all assembled." So that's a great, concise definition of what an ideal representative institution would do. And I emphasize that because, again, when we get to the Federalist, and especially the 10th Federalist paper, you're going to see James Madison make exactly the opposite argument. Ultimately, with respect to this argument for small republics, there's a very different historical perspective that's going on between the two parties. For the Anti-Federalists, small republics are the ideal, and like Rome, the fall is going to come when they extend. For the Federalists, by contrast, they're going to point to the small size of republics in the past as one of the reasons why republics didn't last very long historically. That's an argument that's made in number 9. The third general category of Anti-Federalist thought is the most straightforward one. They simply thought that the way in which the institutions were arranged, the way in which power was divided between the national government and the state governments would lead to too much consolidation, too much centralization. And they argued that this wasn't necessarily the case immediately on paper, although they pointed to several diminishments of state authority which were right there in the Constitution. But especially they argued that the new Constitution set up what they called consolidating tendencies, that over time there were certain provisions of it that would be abused and would lead to the growth of the national power and the further diminishment of state powers. And they pointed to things like the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, one of the powers of Congress. This is such a strong argument that Publius dedicates an entire paper, the 33rd Federalist paper, to rebutting it. Or they point to institutions like the national judiciary, and they predict that it will become a way in which the national government will consolidate power. And there's a whole series of Federalist papers dedicated to responding to that argument. But we would call this third prong, what the Anti-Federalist term, the consolidating tendencies. On that question of consolidating tendencies, this really gets to a sore point for the Anti-Federalists. I've been using this label for them, the Anti-Federalists. Well, that's not the label they chose for themselves. That's the label they were assigned by their opponents. And those of you who know about politics, you know one of the rhetorical advantages you can get in any political debate is that you get to label yourself and to label your opponent. The Federalists call themselves the Federalists because a more federal solution, being in favor of a more federal solution, was a very popular thing at this time. And by that it was meant, as James Madison puts it in the 39th Federalist paper, to have a form of government that was partly federal and partly national, where the states were supreme in certain spheres and the national government would be supreme in certain other spheres, and it was a kind of mixed form. And that seemed to be a pretty popular thing. Not as much of a pure confederation where the states are totally supreme as we had under the Articles, but not a full national consolidation. And that seemed to be the plan that was most appealing at the time. And so the Federalists used the label that identified themselves with that thing. And their opponents are against that thing. That thing that's popular, they're against it, we're for it. This really hurt the Anti-Federalists, I think, in this debate. And I think if the Anti-Federalists could have chosen their own label, they would have called themselves the Republicans. Right? That we are the defenders of true Republican principles. But they didn't get to make that decision. Having gone through those three basic categories of Anti-Federalist argument, I want to add one final important point of debate. And this is a question of who exactly is it who's making the government? Who is constituting the government? Who has the authority to establish this Constitution? And if you want to look in the text for that, you look to the preamble of the Constitution, the very first words of the Constitution. We the people are doing the ordaining and the establishing of the Constitution. We have the authority to do this, to bind one another and to bind our state governments and our town governments. And this view reflects their understanding from the Declaration of Independence. Who is it who has the right to consent to government, after all? It's individuals. These are the ones who, by the laws of nature, are given the authority to establish the government that seems best to them to secure their individual rights. And so the Federalists in this debate are saying, we're going to go back to the people. And bear in mind that the ratification for the Constitution is not done by state governments. State governments aren't agreeing. They're not authorizing this Constitution. The people are in conventions. Now, the conventions are held in individual states, and that's an important fact. But still, it's the people themselves. We're going to the people themselves. This is one of the arguments against the legitimacy of the Articles of Confederation that the Federalists will make. Now, from the Anti-Federalist point of view, many of them take a very different understanding. They believe that this is a confederation, and thus that the states are the contracting parties. The states are the only ones with the authority to make or unmake a constitution. And they see the significance, and they don't like it, of the statement, we the people, in the preamble. And one great example of this is in a speech given by Patrick Henry in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, and let me read that for you. Patrick Henry says, "Sir, give me leave to demand what right had they to say, we the people? My political curiosity, exclusive of my anxious solicitude for the public welfare, leads me to ask, who authorized them to speak the language, we the people, instead of we the states? States are the characteristics and the soul of a confederation. If the states be not the agents of this compact, it must be one great consolidated national government of the people of all the states. I have the highest respect for those gentlemen who formed the convention, and were some of them not here, I would express some testimonial of my esteem for them. America had on a former occasion put the utmost confidence in them, a confidence which was well placed, and I am sure, sir, I would give up anything to them. I would cheerfully confide in them as my representatives. But, sir, on this great occasion, I would demand the cause of their conduct, even from that illustrious man who saved us by his valor. I would have a reason for his conduct." Now, obviously, Patrick Henry is talking about George Washington there. And he's making references also to the likes of James Madison, who's present. So this is a very serious accusation, and not just making an argument against this or that policy, but really questioning their honor. And so you can see what a fundamental dispute this is, and we will carry forward our examination of it in the text. You see there finally one bit of frustration on the part of the Anti-Federalists. They know that no matter what arguments they make, however good they might be in their estimation, the big uphill climb they have is not only against the arguments of the opposition, but against the reputation of the individuals who are in the opposition, the reputation especially of those like Washington and Franklin. They've thrown their weight behind this. And so you can see that the Anti-Federalists, while they're very much up to the task of engaging the Federalists in debate about constitutional principles, they wonder if they can overcome that kind of reputational power. In the next session, we'll dive into those very Federalist arguments and see what they have to say in response.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. If you want to continue learning, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There, you will find over 40 free online courses including Ancient Christianity, the Genesis story, classic children's literature, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that what you'll learn will enrich your life and that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.